Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture on music during the apartheid in South Africa. And today we'll look at mostly the social function of music as used in the struggle for equality, and we'll highlight a couple of different songs and also some of the history and background around South Africa. And this lecture kind of continues on with the themes of music and violence, music as a tool for peace, etc. And we'll talk even further about music and politics in the next lecture. So this is kind of an ongoing series, I guess I'd say, kind of spread out over 4 lectures. So the first, I want to give you a little history about apartheid. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. I'm not sure all of you know the details of it unless you've taken some kind of world history courses or actually specifically South African or apartheid type courses. But really, apartheid came about in 1948 when the Afrikaner Nationalist Party took control of South Africa. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you have a big picture of Africa, and South Africa is very at the bottom there. And in 1948, the Nationalist Party took over and really started instituting many laws that put into place apartheid. And really, what apartheid means is apartness. It's translated from the Afrikaans, which is a language used in South Africa. It's an ideology that was supported by the National Party that was elected into South African as the leaders of South Africa. You have to remember, though, that they weren't elected really by the majority of the population. It was actually a very small minority white population who elected them because many of the black would-be voters were very disenfranchised at the time. On paper, the apartheid laws, etc., they were an attempt, or at least they were said or put forward as a way to have separate but equal development of different racial groups in South Africa. It called for equal development and freedoms of cultural expression, but in the way this was implemented, and I think I'll give you several examples, this was completely not possible. So many of these laws put in place in the 1950s existed in some form before the 1950s, either as policy or as just the way that the country was working. But they're really what made apartheid as a whole was really the implementation of these laws, putting these practices into law in the 1950s. And I just want to highlight several of the kind of most important acts that were put in during apartheid that constituted the kind of racist policies of the South African Nationalist Party, the Afrikaner Nationalist Party. And the first one was the Population Registration Act in the 1950s. This meant that people had to be registered according to their racial group, and they were treated differently according to their population group. And this law was kind of the basis for apartheid. There was the Group Areas Act again in 1950, which started the physical separation of the races, especially in urban areas. It also called for the removal of some groups of people and set them aside in different areas according to their racial group. In 1959, so really all throughout the 50s, there were laws being passed really to try and separate blacks and whites in South Africa. In 1959, there was the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which in its title sounds like, oh, self-governance sounds like a good idea, but really what this was a law saying that requiring that different racial groups had to live in different areas, and Bantu was the term used for black Africans. And so really only a very small percentage of South Africa was left for black people, who were the vast majority of the population. And this Bantu Self-Government Act also got rid of some of the black spots, the kind of areas where black Africans were living inside white areas, especially in the townships and cities. And what it resulted was that many black Africans were moved to kind of slum areas, and they were forced onto lands that they legally couldn't own, but they were kind of squatting on the property there, or it was owned by white people who they had to pay pretty exorbitant rents to. And we'll see kind of the result of that in a second in a few slides. A couple more acts that were really important was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act in 1949, the Immorality Act in 1950, basically prohibiting marriages between blacks, whites, and non-white people. Thus, it was not just blacks; it was also the Asian. There was a significant South Asian population in South Africa, so it basically prohibited any marriage and/or sexual relations between whites and non-whites. So along with these kind of prohibition of marriage and prohibition of relations, even having, there was also a voter registration act, etc., that really was put into force to separate as much as possible the minority white population and the black population. One more act that really kind of started the downfall of apartheid was the Afrikaans language requirement in 1976. There was an act put in that Afrikaans, the language spoken by the minority white population, was going to be the only language used in schools. And so there was a big protest in Soweto, South Africa, in 1976, outside of Johannesburg. And many students, young people, were protesting this act because, for the most part, black South Africans spoke English. And during this protest, police opened fire with live bullets and tear gas, and the government crackdown that followed really kind of brought the whole world's attention onto South Africa, and it really shattered the illusions that apartheid had brought any sort of peace or prosperity, but it was actually just a very racist policy to begin with. So I want to that's kind of a very brief, very quick overview of apartheid in South Africa. And I just want to remind you that a lot of these acts and these laws were cloaked behind legal language and misspeak, such as this Bantu Self-Government Act, like I mentioned. That sounds fine. Self-governance sounds fine, but really what it amounts to is separation and kind of stripping powers away from minorities. And then what these acts and laws really do is substantiate the cause or the reason behind apartheid was really racism and a fear that white South Africans, who are already a very small minority, will be further marginalized by the growing black population, by interracial children if they were having, blacks and whites were having sexual relations, and basically the eventual stripping of white control over South Africa. And to me, I don't normally wade into kind of contemporary politics, but at least to me, it's striking some of the language used in describing these laws and enacting these laws, and even just some of the rhetoric surrounding the apartheid era laws. I see very similar striking language being used by not only in white nationalist speech in the U.S. today, but also on conservative radio and talk shows and stuff like that, and even by Trump and his administration. And I see the same sort of language about same sort of coded language, and I think this is very troubling. And maybe I want you to think about that a little bit. If you could agree or disagree, but when you see such striking language parallels between a time of history, apartheid, that was just pretty horrendous, and the same sorts of things being said by people today, it should make you perk up and pay attention. So I want a little bit about why, outside of just racism, that apartheid really took hold, and really it was a matter of economic competition, a very unequal distribution, and gerrymandering. And again, that last term, gerrymandering, the kind of breaking up of political districts to kind of favor a certain group or another, is something that's going on right now in the United States. And so this is another parallel that I think we should all be paying very close attention to. But what really made this kind of the economic situation for apartheid attractive to a minority white population is because South Africa was very much a mineral export type country, so it was very based on gold and diamonds and natural resources. And so what happened is you had this very small white population who owned the capital, who owned the corporations or companies extracting these minerals, and a very abundant black labor population. And there was a strong push to keep the black labor population unskilled and very low paying. So you want to have these very low paying jobs, but they want to have a lot of people doing them. And there was a large fear among white workers that there was this large supply of African labor that was low priced. And so there are a lot of laws enacted, or kind of union enactions by white tradesmen and white unions and government officials, including the police, that tried to discourage Africans from traveling to work in the mines and competing for these positions, the more skilled positions in the mines and industry. There were a bunch of laws that were passed to limit the movement of black Africans to different areas for work. So some laws actually limited like I mentioned, the Bantu Self-Government Act, where it moved black Africans into different areas of South Africa, and they wouldn't allow those the Africans to travel to where they worked, and they also required them to have a passport to have work, but they wouldn't issue passports. And so this is the whole problem: is that basically what happened is that the black Africans were moved to areas, there was no work there, they weren't allowed to travel to work, and they weren't issued passports to travel to the work, so effectively shutting down the whole or a good portion of the black labor population in the effort to keep semi-skilled mining jobs for the whites who had them. And eventually, after World War II, really there was a big push to produce more mineral exports, and so there were black workers moving into the mining industries, and there was a real big fear that these kind of upwardly mobile black workers would surpass the poor whites, working in the industry currently. And so that's what became the push behind the election of the African National Party in 1948, was this fear that the white population was going to be surpassed economically and eventually socially by the black larger majority population. And the final issue was gerrymandering, which was a big importance in terms of how the National Party was elected in 1948, because basically because even though the white population was a very small minority of the country, because of gerrymandering and things like that, they were able to elect the Afrikaner National Party, which was the ones that put in place the apartheid rules. And if you look at your screen, you have just a little chart of the kind of different facts from apartheid South Africa. And so you have really huge differences in allocation of land versus population between black and white. The share of the national income is extremely unequal. Even goes down to the minimum taxable income. So not only were blacks poor, unable to own land, made a much smaller share of the national income, their minimum taxable income was lower than the white taxable income. So if you were a black person, you had a minimum taxable income of 360 rand, while if you're a white, you'd actually make more money and not be taxed on it. So extraordinarily racist kind of legal policies. And as you can see, it goes all the way down. Doctors per population, there was one doctor per 44,000 blacks versus one doctor per 400 whites. The infant mortality rate was astonishingly high for the black population, and very industrialized country low for the white population. So really, all through society, you had an extremely unequal distribution of wealth. You have this kind of competition for labor that in some ways restricted black movements, in other ways didn't. And you also have this political gerrymandering that really favored the white vote over the black vote. The economics, even though apartheid ended officially, in 1994, the economics of apartheid really still largely persist today, although there are some exceptions. And there's a great article in the New York Times from I think 2017, October 24th, 2017, saying the end of apartheid in South Africa, ? Not in economic terms. So largely still, many of the black South Africans live in very very slum-like conditions, although there is a segment of the population who has done well in post-apartheid South Africa. So really currently, 10% of all South Africans, the majority of those, that 10% who's white, own over 90% of the national wealth. So again, this hugely unequal distribution. While as 80% of the population, which is overwhelmingly black, owns nothing at all. I mean, it's property, land, etc. The people who have gotten ahead, the black South Africans who have succeeded, oftentimes that means knowing somebody in politics or paying bribes or somebody being very lucky. And so even though the Afrikaner National Party is no longer in power and you have the African National Congress ruling, there's still kind of a large amount of corruption that people are upset about, but it has led to, in some respects, a portion of the black and Asian population of South Africa succeeding and becoming wealthy. So while there was a political liberation of South Africa, apartheid ended, a lot of the rules and laws were appealed and changed. As the New York Times article quotes a woman, she says, "I've gone from shack to shack," and it hasn't really affected the majority of Black South Africans' lives. So let's switch over. That's kind of a broad history of apartheid. And let's switch over to looking at the music. And when I'll talk about some of the social functions of music, we've talked about social functions of music a bit in this class. And I want to talk about some of the very specific ways it was used in apartheid South Africa. Really, music in a large part kind of served three purposes. It helped organize collective action in terms of people marching together against and protesting these policies. It helped workers persevere and helped prisoners endure their situations. So many times the black workers were in pretty awful conditions in the mines, in the fields, and the music really helped them persevere through that. Even though they were making very little money, they were making some income. And it also helped prisoners endure the pretty awful conditions in the prison. Many of these prisoners were political prisoners, obviously, so they were just imprisoned and executed for their political beliefs. They were not actually criminals, and so music was a very central part of kind of the South African or apartheid era prison scene. And it was also, in a way, related to the collective action. Music was also used as a tool for intimidation during protests, and I think we'll get a couple examples of that, how music was really used to kind of bolster a sense of community and also used to kind of intimidate the other side of the protest. It's also good to remember that music, just as much as it was anti-anything, if it was anti-apartheid or protest music or resistance music, a lot of the music in South Africa was just as uplifting as it was anti-anything. So it was creating community, it was creating solidarity, creating, you know, good feelings, and it wasn't all just anti something. So there's two examples I want to highlight about the social function of music, and the first would be the gumboot dances, which are pretty famous, very famous in South Africa now. And what these were dances made by miners who were wearing these big, thick rubber Wellington boots as they worked in the mines, and they were kind of a way that miners could express coded dissatisfaction with the mines, the economic situation, and the politics of the area. There were many laws in apartheid South Africa that restricted the movement and or communication of miners. Sometimes they couldn't even speak to each other while they were working. And these gumboot dances really were a way to kind of, it was kind of a Morse code for communication. They would stomp their feet and slap their boots, and really it was kind of a way to express a political message through dance and music, kind of in an effort to fight the oppression of the government and the mining companies. This later on moved into a tourist draw and as entertainment. So now gumboot dances are kind of a South African national kind of a musical dance heritage type thing. So you'll see it everywhere. You'll see people on the street doing it, performing it. You'll see people at tourist attractions doing it. So it's very much been adopted by the South Africa as kind of a symbol of national identity, but it really started off as this kind of dance of protest. One more example, and I'll show you examples of these in a second. Another example is the toi-toi dance, and this was music brought in, kind of a dance brought in from Zimbabwe, from the struggles in Zimbabwe, and this was used by marchers in anti-apartheid protests to kind of dance, create a community, create solidarity, and also intimidate the police as they marched together. And so there's a little picture of on the kind of top right of your screen, all these little boys doing the toi-toi march in front of a group of policemen who are observing the rest of the march. And again, both a way as an intimidation, also to create a kind of a solidarity amongst the marchers. And so I thought I'd give you one example. This is the gumboot dance. I tried to find examples of really kind of earlier ones, but it was really hard to find good ones on YouTube. So this is a great example, though, of how the gumboot dance has transitioned from a way of protest, although it still has kind of the essence of protest in it. But this is done by a group of schoolboys, and you can see their schoolmates all surrounding them, and it's a cool dance, and it's fun to watch. But again, remember it has this history behind it, and I think it's also now a history of the gumboot dance is now a history of maybe achieving over oppression, or like the getting rid of racial oppression in the country. Although, as I mentioned, there's still quite a bit of that going on. So pause for a second, maybe watch a little bit of this gumboot dance, and yeah, and then come back to the lecture. The second example is, like I mentioned, the Toi Toi March, and this is I posted a video down below, just a short video that explains some of the background behind the Toi Toi music and dance used as marchers used it for the anti-apartheid protests in the street. So watch this short video by Ethnomusicology Explained, describing the Toi Toi. And its kind of importation from Zimbabwe and its use in South Africa. So those are great examples of the use of music, the social functions of music, and in particular music. And I thought it'd be interesting to just describe really briefly the importance of Fusili Mini, who is a singer, unionist, activist, and he was a member of the African National Congress, and he was actually the first one to be executed in South Africa. And his story is, tragic. He was executed along with a number of colleagues on charges of, really trumped up charges that, ridiculous charges that had nothing to do with reality. But his story, the way he went to the gallows in the prison, was quite inspiring to other people. And he was walked to be hung for these false charges, really. And the whole prison was quiet, and he had a beautiful bass voice. And I guess early in the morning they would hang everyone at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the whole prison woke up and heard this, powerful bass voice singing as he walked down the passages and stood on the stool and was about to be executed. What he was singing was this song, which we'll talk about in a second, but he was basically defiant to the end in his voice, and he was singing as he was executed. And so he is a great example of how music really was used not only as protest, but it was also used as protest to the very end of life. And in many ways, the way he went to be executed, and the way he was singing, and his defiance and his song was really an inspiration to everyone in the prison, all the rest of the political prisoners there, and to people beyond. And so he's kind of held up as this symbol of defiance and fighting against apartheid to the end. Some of and we'll get back to the song that Mini was singing as he was executed. That it was also one of your required listening examples, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I just want to list off some of the musical features of apartheid era songs. And really, there are a lot of the features that you would normally find in traditional African music and South African music. And so the first feature would be that a lot of the songs emerged out of music used for daily activities. They were storytelling, song, and poetry were always part of the South African cultural experience. And these songs emerged out of storytelling, poetry. They emerged out of church hymns, and they were anti-apartheid, and they were pro-community, and so it was really not in many cases the music was kind of homegrown and emerged out of songs that people already knew. They oftentimes use call and response, which is very common in African music, especially in kind of the South African traditional, or Southern Africa, has picked up a lot of the call and response and also kind of church-like chorus hymns. And we'll give an example of that with the Senzeni Na song in a second. But the call and response and kind of close harmony is very common in Southern Africa, and especially in the South African apartheid songs. You also think there's a lot of repetition in these songs. A lot of these songs used in anti-apartheid protests were repetitive. They said the same lyrics over and over. They had the same melody. And what that did was it allowed people who were not, musicians, not had musical backgrounds to participate. It created a community, a wider community. This wasn't complex music. This was music for everyone who was protesting apartheid. Many of the songs a lot of the songs had this kind of embodied rhythmic aspect to it. And so when you're marching, you're opposing apartheid, you're marching with your compatriots in the street, oftentimes these songs have these embodied rhythms. And so you have the Toy Toy dance has one example of that. And you have this just the way of the music becoming embodied and then therefore becoming more powerful, as it was not just a cerebral music, but it was something you could get your whole body into, and it becomes much more of a powerful statement and a powerful way of organizing and inspiring people protesting. And the final example would be a lot of the songs used kind of sonic disguise, and so there was a lot of censorship out there, and composers used coded language in their songs to express protest. So just like the gumboot dances were kind of coded rhythmic dances protesting apartheid, many songs used language that could fit around censorship, that wouldn't be immediately banned, to get around censorship and also still express protest. In many of these songs would also use they would also change the lyrics depending on the news of the day. And so there's a great example of a song in English goes, "Tomorrow at 4 o'clock, Mandela will be released." And this was kind of celebrating when Nelson Mandela was going to be released from prison. It was a very popular song. And after his release, it was shifted. The lyrics changed. The song was the same, but they just shifted the lyrics just a little bit to fit the news of the day. And so that was very common, another common feature of apartheid era songs. So I thought I should have you listen to Senzeni Na. This is a very powerful kind of call and response, choral hymn-like song that was very popular in the apartheid era. So I would say pause and listen to the video. This is actually from a film, although it says Hans Zimmer wrote the music. This has nothing to do with Hans Zimmer. It's actually the traditional South African song. But listen to the linked video down below, and then come back and we'll talk about it. So again, this is a great example of call and response, kind of hymn-like singing, and this song also typifies many of the rhetorical devices that anti-apartheid songs use. And so in this song we have questions at the beginning repeated over and over. The question, Senzeni Na, is like, what have we done? Is our sin the fact that we are black? Is our sin the truth? And these rhetorical questions are obviously the only answer you can have to these very the rhetorical questions they're very powerful questions too, is that of course the answer is no, you've done nothing. Is your sin the fact that we're black? It's not a sin, so that's not a sin. So it's all these forcing the listener to answer no, and you have to conclude, if you answer and listen to the song, you have to conclude the kind of blatant hypocrisy and racism that underpinned apartheid. So this is kind of a rhetorical assault on apartheid through music, and also encompassing some of the features we just discussed. Another song was Pasopa Verwoord, which is the song that Mimi sang as he went to the gallows. So this one was famous, also made famous by Miriam Makeba, who is again a very famous singer in apartheid South Africa. And this is again many of the same or similar features are being displayed in this song. A lot of repetition. This one, instead of asking questions, is basically warning the listeners of what's about to come. And Verwoerd was kind of the prime minister, politician in South Africa in the 50s, and very hated person because of all the things he enacted. And it's this song is kind of a inspiring people and also warning the white racist politicians of what's to come. What's a little bit interesting is this the use of language in here. The word Pasopa is actually a word chosen from the Afrikaans language, or similar to a word in the Afrikaans language that means watch out, really. So watch out, here comes the black man, of our word. And there's other words in Xhosa and other black South African languages that could have been used here, but the composer chose this kind of more forceful and Afrikaans language word, Pasopa, as kind of as a challenge really being issued to the Afrikaans authorities, the apartheid authorities. And so singing this Pas op Verwoord, the marchers who were singing this really ensured that the apartheid authorities were able to understand that this was a warning being issued to them. And as one freedom fighter and African National Congress executive committee member said, that he said, quote, "When you really, really wanted to make the Boers or the Afrikaners mad, you sang Pas op Verwoord because you were almost daring them." So unlike the previous Senzenina, which is asking rhetorically these very simple questions that the only answer could possibly be no, this Pas op Verwoord was a warning and kind of again this kind of taunt of the apartheid era politicians and government. So having discussed all this, I really want you to watch a good portion of Amandla, which is a great video about music and its role in the apartheid struggle in South Africa. Unfortunately, I can't find it free online for you, but it is available through on YouTube and Amazon, places like that, for about $2. I really would encourage you to watch it from about 1 hour 5 minutes and about 14 seconds to about 1 hour 26 minutes. That portion gives you a good kind of overview of what we've been talking about in the lecture, and I think you'll find it very interesting. It's got lots of great music and really arresting imagery that I think you'll really enjoy. So please take the time and go find this available for you on Netflix or Amazon, someplace like that. Once you've watched that 20 minutes or so, I want you to come back and I want to talk about kind of post-apartheid South Africa and what happened really in with music, with race, with whiteness and blackness in South Africa. So pause here, find Amandla and watch a bit of that. And coming back to the idea of kind of post-apartheid South Africa, I was actually having a great conversation with a colleague of mine about kind of the fate of the young Afrikaners, the young white South Africans who are young enough to really have not seen or not really kind of participated in the apartheid struggle and or even have any kind of connection to that. And there's been a kind of a feeling that these white South Africaners have been left kind of culturally adrift after apartheid. They don't have any connection to the revolution, and they are having their background is kind of forbidden. So there's this really interesting way that South Africans, white and black, are actually projecting a future forward after apartheid. So following the 1994 elections that brought in the African National Congress, quite a large percentage, I think it's about 60-some% of white South Africans felt like they didn't have a home in South Africa, and this kind of turmoil and rootlessness and implicit blame, even though these are younger people who really never took part in the apartheid era, they feel like these young white South Africans really have to either emigrate or they have a very challenging time dealing with the country as is. So you'll find many musical artists, both black and white, that are really kind of addressing South African culture and race in really radical, questing, open ways. There's kind of a real playfulness that you see in creativity with a lot of these artists, and I want to highlight a few of those in the next few slides. I think maybe there was a general euphoria, as you see on the screen, with apartheid's ends, but really the categories of black and white in terms of race really remained, and in some cases they were actually hardened. And here I want to quote from a scholar, Christopher Ballantyne, in his article Rethinking Whiteness. I think it actually sums up this era of post-apartheid white and black racial identities in music pretty well. And he says, quote, "In South Africa, the prospects for social integration were auspicious after the first democratic elections in 1994. As the popular music of the time shows, it was not only blacks who exulted in the new rainbow, quote, euphoria, many whites did so too. But for millions of black and white citizens, this moment was short-lived. The government's adoption of neoliberal policies and had severe social consequences, which it and the new elite sought to conceal behind populist calls to race solidarity, a new racial typecasting, and slurs aimed at whites in general. White popular music has responded to these reversals in a variety of ways, including direct criticism, sharp satire, humor, and the expression of fugitive identities. Perhaps more remarkably, white musicians have stressed the need for self-reinvention in music that is ironic, unpredictable, and transgressive. These songs play with malleable identities, tokens of disdain for fixed or essential identities, and they are hopeful signposts toward a more integrated future. Again, that's a quote from Christopher Valentine, but I think it's really interesting if we kind of take that quote, that idea of the difficulties of race, of whiteness and blackness in a post-apartheid South Africa, and we look at our next two examples I'll show you. I think if you take some time and look at Antwoord, who is quite famous, actually, they played at Coachella, and then also compare that. I think I've listed two examples here, so Spoke Matumbo and Antwoord, and really look at how they're presenting whiteness and blackness, and keep that quote that I just read you in mind about how younger white South Africans really are pushing the bounds. They're using these kind of transgressive identities. They're kind of really kind of being ironic and critiquing society in a way. And I really want you to compare that too with the Spoke Matumbo's video Control, and just see how you watch how you can see race being portrayed in these two music videos. So take a second here and watch those two videos linked on Canvas, and come back and I'll talk a bit more. So if you watched Antwoord first, I think it's really their example of playing on this idea of ZEF culture, Z-E-F, and this is really an embodiment of kind of the transgressive, trashy, malleable, unpredictable identities that I was just talking about. I think you see that in a lot of their videos, and I think they're even though they've had some controversy as a group, as kind of some of the things they've said and done, I think you could really look at a bunch of their videos and see this type of playing with ZEF culture, playing with irony, playing with kind of transgressive or kind of different identities here that I think is a response to the racial politics in post-apartheid South Africa. Spoke Matumbo is really at the forefront of kind of the African electronic dance music, and he kind of integrates a variety of electronic genres, dubstep, punk, and also many kind of native South African ideas and images in his videos. I think with both of these videos, Antwoord's, I think Freaky and Spoke Matumbo's Control, I think you see depictions of race that have echoes of the past, but are also attempting to kind of forge a future that is different than the apartheid that we've talked about so far, kind of the struggle and music and the integration of music and apartheid before the end of apartheid, and this kind of post-apartheid really kind of wide open field where some racial attitudes were hardened, and artists are really pushing the bounds of what's acceptable, and they're really trying to chart a course forward. And I think these two videos are great examples of that. So I would encourage you to go back and watch more of these kind of post-apartheid artists. There are several out there that I would recommend. I'd also encourage you to, if you haven't been able to find the Amandla video, please watch that. That's a great video for you to kind of sum up the history of apartheid in music in South Africa. So thanks very much.